The second, sorry, the second low effort cognitive process we're going to talk about is something called self-fulfilling prophecies. Um, this is an interesting idea where a self-fulfilling prophecy, what's going to happen here is that you think things are going to go a certain way. That influences your behavior, and sure enough, the the thing that you were worried about does in fact act itself out. So let me show you. Let me give you an example. I know that was kind of a confusing definition. Let me give you an example. When I was at Iowa State, there was a researcher who was looking at the self-fulfilling prophecies of high school drinking. And what they did in this longitudinal study is they asked parents at Wave One, when the kids were in high school, they asked them, "Is your child going to drink when they're in high school? Are they going to drink alcohol in high school?" And parents could either say yes or no, and there are other questions too. And then what happened was, years later, so when the kid is actually, like a senior in high school, they asked the kids, "Do you drink?" And what they found is that if the mothers, it was mostly mothers, if the mothers expected their kids to drink in high school, then they actually did. Now, the mechanisms for that, are different. Are different depending on the person, the situation. But imagine a case like this. Let's say a mother, let's say a mother says, when their daughter or son is in ninth grade, so freshman in high school, and they say, "Yes, when my daughter or son is a senior in 12th grade, they will drink." What is that mother likely to do? Well, that mother is likely to do things that help the drinking process. For example, they're the kind of moms who say, "Hey, if you guys are going to drink, I'd rather you guys do it at my house. So just drop off your keys in this bucket, come over here and drink." All right. So the mother is actually help facilitating that behavior. So she thinks it's going to happen. She conducts behaviors that facilitate it happening, and then sure enough, it happens. All right, and that's what a self-fulfilling prophecy is. So let me give you an example of how this works with something called teacher expectations. So there was a study by Rosenthal, and what Rosenthal was looking at was going to be this idea of self-fulfilling prophecies, such that your expectations actually lead to the behavior coming true. All right, so what Rosenthal, and that's the definition of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what Rosenthal did is she got the list of children's names in a classroom. And she went to all these teachers, and she gave them a list of not all the kids, but of certain kids from their class. And they said, "These kids are bloomers," meaning that they're really, really smart. And then there was a list and then whoever wasn't on the list was just an average student. So now you're a teacher and you're armed with this information. And so let's say Chris, was on the bloomer list. Well, what then happened, theoretically, self-fulfilling prophecies work, is that because I'm on the bloomer list, the teachers would expect me to be smarter than the non-bloomer, than the kids on the non-bloomer list. And the question then becomes, does that translate to me actually performing better on standardized testing? So what you see here in this graph is we have the bloomers in the red right here, and the non-bloomers, or the average kids, in the blue. And what they did is, after the year ended, they assessed these kids' IQ at the end of the semester, or at the end of the year, sorry. They also did at the beginning of the year. And what they found is, I want you to look at these differences here, between here, between here, between here. And what you see is that in all cases, all the kids are gaining IQ points, which is good. Everyone's learning. Check. But the biggest learning comes from the bloomers. And if you look at the difference in 80 here versus like 48%. That difference is 10 IQ points gained. So even though everyone's gaining, the bloomers are gaining more. 20% gain, same idea. 30% gain, same idea. The bloomers are always gaining more than the non-bloomers. Now, I want to note a couple things about how interesting this is that these kids were just randomly assigned. There was no rhyme or reason why one kid would be a bloomer and one kid wouldn't be. There was no rhyme or reason. It was just a random assignment to condition. Some kids were bloomers, some were not. When the teachers were interviewed about this, they said that they knew who the bloomers were and the non-bloomers were because they had the list. But they said that something interesting is that they actually didn't give the bloomers any extra attention. They didn't consciously change their teaching style as from the bloomer to the non-bloomer. They actually reported they felt that they taught everyone the same. And so what's happening here is this is evidence for, once again, low effort, non-conscious thinking. You just do it without thinking about it. Where what you would do is maybe if a bloomer kid got a question correct, maybe the teacher just gave them more praise than the non-bloomer kid. Or maybe when they were doing pairs of like group work, they put all the bloomers together and the non-bloomers together. Maybe there were some subtle kind of things like this that the teachers just weren't aware of, but their expectations clouded. I don't say that. Their expectations influenced these processes. All right, and these processes then predict behavior. Processes being the low effort thinking, the subtle things that the teachers did that they weren't consciously aware of when they were interviewed. All right. So this is an interesting study. This is the only one I'm going to talk about for self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's kind of neat in the sense that your expectations lead to a behavior, and that behavior is exactly what you thought it would be. All right, just like the teachers and the bloomers here. All right, now we're going to move on to the last piece, and these are called heuristics. What we have to remember is that heuristics are, they're defined as basically like mental shortcuts, so rules of thumb. But how they function is they're going to be functioning as a way that we can process all the information coming in the world. Think about all the decisions you have to make at any point in time, and I said that we cannot process every single thing. We can only process a part of it. And so when we're processing, we have all this information coming our way, we have to rely on a mental shortcuts to help us process this stuff. And that's what heuristics do. All right, so they're going to help us make decisions, but they're going to be low effort. All right, so we're just going to do them without thinking about it. We're going to rely on these quick and dirty kind of judgments to help us make decisions. And there's two we're going to talk about. There's more that exist. But the first is the representative heuristic. And that's the idea that in our mind, we clump similar things together. So let's say that you're walking on campus and you see a person, a male, wearing like no shirt, because apparently that's what they do at Gettysburg College. When it's hot out, guys wear no shirts. For whatever reason, I couldn't tell you. But there you go. So let's say you see that. Well, you're going to judge them based on a lot of things. And because fraternity members are the ones who wear shirts less, apparently, then you're going to assume that, they drink beer. They read sports magazines. They have lots of friends. They're partiers. Like, why? It's just like if you see a female on campus wearing a sorority shirt, are you going to be like, she's sexually permissive? Well, no, that doesn't mean anything. But what we do is we start to lump similar things together. And mentally, this is a shortcut we use to help us make quick decisions when we need them. All right? So if you're out at a bar, for example, and you see a girl wearing a sorority shirt, you're probably going to be like, she's sexually permissive, and that's going to determine whether or not you approach her or not. All right? And we do that because we're lumping these things together. Sorority equals sexually permissive. Sorority equals drunk party girl. Sorority equals all these things. And in reality, that's not the case at all. Let me be clear. Let me be very clear on that. Not all sorority people are like that, but what's going to happen in our mind is that's the perception we get. and we're going to lump these things together. And that's the availability heuristic. So let me give you an example of how this works. So this is an example that's used in research a lot. You have Mr. Clark, and you see this description of him. He's 38 years old, grew up in Massachusetts, doesn't drink or smoke, reads Shakespeare in his spare time. Is he likely to be a truck driver or a classic English literature professor? All right. So which ones do you guys think? All right. Well, most of you probably picked the English literature professor. But why? Well, maybe because Massachusetts means upper class. He reads Shakespeare. He doesn't smoke. Therefore, he must be a professor and not a truck driver. He can't be a truck driver. Truck drivers don't read Shakespeare, right? But why not? Why can't they? In all reality, the answer to the question is 50-50. Like, you actually don't know if he's a truck driver or an English professor. You don't know. But if you ask people to make a percentage judgment, a lot of people will say, 80% he's a professor, 20% a truck driver. But the real answer is 50-50. So why we have that kind of that divergence between those two is because of our representative heuristic. The final heuristic is called the availability heuristic. And this is judging things by how quickly examples are able to come to mind. So, if you, as an example, if you, let's say, recently read an article in the newspaper about, let's say, a massive plane crash. 350 people died in this plane crash going from New York to Atlanta. All right. Now, all of a sudden, you live in New York and you have to get to Atlanta. Are you going to fly or are you going to drive? Or are you just not going to go? Well, according to this, what's going to come to your mind first is going to be, oh my gosh, there was just a plane crash. And guess what's going to happen? You're not going to go fly. This is exactly what happened after September 11th. After September 11th, the airline industry took a huge hit financially because everyone thought that there were going to be terrorists on planes and those planes were going to crash into a fiery ball of death, basically. And so nobody flew for the longest time. Or, to use a more recent example, I think it was 3 years ago, there was an Italian cruise ship that killed hundreds of people because it hit land and it tilted on its side and hundreds of people died. A lot of other more people were rescued. But what the cruise industry saw was a massive decline in cruise ships reservations because everyone was just assuming, I read this story about how they crashed. I don't want to go on a cruise because what if they crash? And that's what the availability heuristic is. You make decisions based on how quickly things can come to your memory. And if you see, let's say, 100 news clips about planes, crashing and terrorists taking over planes, guess what? You're less likely to fly because that's what's going to come to your mind first. And you're going to be like, I don't want to be on that plane. And that's how these heuristics work. Notice how these are low-level processes. So what basic human motivation are we dealing with here? The people are lazy. This is absolutely people are lazy. If you actually thought about these heuristics, if you actually thought about self-fulfilling prophecies, if you actually thought about how priming works, there are clearly ways that we preserve our cognitive energy, and that makes us lazy. We don't spend the time to think about it. If we did, we would know that not all fraternity people are drunkards, not all sorority girls are promiscuous. We would know that a very, very, very small percent of airplanes and cruise ships actually crash. But we don't use that because we are lazy. All right? And that's the basic human motivation for how that works. When we come back, we're going to switch to high effort social cognition, and then we'll end topic 3.